The woman's hands were trembling as she reached into the wooden crate behind the saloon, her fingers closing around something that might have once been bread. And she didn't even care that two men were laughing at her from the back door, because hunger had long since stripped away her pride. Ophelia Parker had been beautiful once, or so her mother used to tell her before the fever took her 3 months ago, leaving Ophelia alone in a world that had no mercy for a 20-year-old woman with nothing to her name but the tattered dress on her back, and shoes with holes worn clean through the soles. The September heat of 1889 in Guthrie, Oklahoma was unforgiving, baking the red dirt streets until they cracked like old leather, and the dust seemed to work its way into everything, including the stale piece of cornbread she just fished from between rotting potato peels and what looked like the remains of someone's breakfast. She was about to take a bite when a shadow fell across her, and she looked up to see a man standing there, tall and broad-shouldered, with a black hat that had seen better days and eyes the color of a summer storm. He wasn't looking at her with disgust or pity, which was somehow worse because she couldn't read his expression at all. And for a long moment, they just stared at each other while her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "That ain't fit for eating," he said finally, his voice low and rough around the edges, the kind of voice that sounded like it didn't get used for talking much. Ophelia clutched the bread tighter, ready to run if she had to, though she didn't know where she'd go since the sheriff had already warned her twice about sleeping in the stable. "It's fine," she said, hating how her voice came out small and defensive. "I've had worse." The cowboy studied her for another moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a few coins, turning them over in his weathered palm like he was counting. "Come on," he said, jerking his head toward the main street. "Restaurant's still serving lunch." She couldn't move, because kindness from strangers in Guthrie was rarer than rain in August, and she'd learned the hard way that nothing came free. "Why?" she asked, the word coming out sharper than she intended. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression that she couldn't quite name. "Because I remember what it's like to be that hungry," he said simply. "And because my mama would come back from the grave and whip me if she knew I walked past someone in need." "Name's Benjamin Lawson." Ophelia hesitated, still clutching the stale bread, but her stomach was growling so loud she was surprised he couldn't hear it, and the thought of real food, hot food, was enough to make her dizzy. "Ophelia Parker," she said finally, dropping the bread back into the crate and wiping her hands on her dress, though it probably just spread the dirt around more than anything. They walked down the dusty street together, an odd pair that drew stares from the townspeople going about their business, and Ophelia kept her eyes down because she knew what they were thinking, knew what assumptions they were making about a woman like her walking with a man like him. Benjamin didn't seem to notice or care, his long strides eating up the distance to the restaurant with the kind of confidence that came from a man who knew his place in the world and wasn't bothered by the opinions of others. The restaurant was called Mary's Place, a small establishment wedged between the general store and the barber shop, with gingham curtains in the windows and the smell of frying meat wafting out every time someone opened the door. Ophelia had walked past it 100 times in the last few weeks, pressing her nose against the glass like a child and watching the lucky people inside eating their fill, never imagining she'd actually set foot through that door. Benjamin held it open for her, and she stepped inside, immediately overwhelmed by the warmth and the noise and the incredible smell of real food. There were maybe a dozen tables scattered around the room, most of them occupied by men in various states of dusty exhaustion, their hats hung on chair backs, and their faces lined with the hard work of building a new territory. A woman who must have been Mary herself came bustling over, wiping her hands on her apron and giving Ophelia a quick once-over that made her want to shrink into herself. "Benjamin Lawson," Mary said, her face breaking into a smile that transformed her from severe to almost pretty. "Haven't seen you in town for a few weeks. Thought maybe you decided to stay out at that ranch of yours permanently." "Had some business to attend to," Benjamin said, gesturing to an empty table by the window. "We'll take that one if it's available." Mary's eyes flicked to Ophelia again, and this time there was something almost like sympathy in her expression. "Of course," she said, leading them over and producing 2 menus from her apron pocket. "Coffee, please," Benjamin said, pulling out a chair for Ophelia before settling into his own. "And bring us some water, too." Ophelia sat down carefully, like the chair might break under her weight, though she couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds soaking wet at this point. Her hands were shaking as she picked up the menu, and the words seemed to swim on the page because she couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten anything that required a menu to order from. There were steaks and chops and chicken dinners, vegetables and potatoes and fresh bread, pies and cakes and puddings for dessert, and the prices next to each item made her stomach clench because she was adding them up automatically, unable to stop herself from calculating how much this meal was going to cost him. "Order whatever you want," Benjamin said, as if reading her mind. "Don't worry about the price." She looked up at him, really seeing him for the first time in the better light of the restaurant. He was maybe 24 or 25, with dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck, and the kind of tan that spoke of long days in the sun. His hands were resting on the table, rough and calloused, with scars across the knuckles that told stories she couldn't begin to guess at. He wasn't handsome in the classical sense, but there was something solid about him, something steady and real that made her chest ache with a longing she didn't want to examine too closely. "I can't let you buy me all this food," she said, even though her stomach was screaming at her to shut up and order everything on the menu. "It wouldn't be right." Benjamin leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving her face. "Why not?" "Because I don't even know you," Ophelia said, setting the menu down and folding her hands in her lap to hide the trembling. "Because I can't pay you back. Because people don't just do things like this without expecting something in return." Something flashed across his face then, something that might have been anger or hurt or both. "I'm not people," he said quietly, "and I'm not expecting anything except for you to eat a decent meal. When's the last time you had one?" The question hit her harder than she expected, and to her horror, she felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them back furiously because she'd promised herself she wouldn't cry anymore, that tears were a luxury she couldn't afford, but Benjamin's kindness was threatening to undo all her carefully constructed walls. 4 days, she admitted finally. "A woman at the church gave me some soup." His jaw tightened, and he picked up his menu with a deliberate kind of calm. When Mary came back with the coffee and water, he didn't even look at the prices as he started ordering. "We'll have 2 of the fried chicken dinners with all the sides, extra bread, and a bowl of the beef stew to start. Then bring us 2 pieces of whatever pie you've got today, and a pot of honey if you have it." Mary was writing it all down, her eyebrows climbing higher with each item. "That's a lot of food, Benjamin." "Then we'll take what we don't finish home," he said, pouring coffee for both of them without missing a beat. "And add some of those sugar cookies you make. Half a dozen should do it." When Mary had bustled off to place their order, Ophelia wrapped her hands around the coffee cup, letting the warmth seep into her cold fingers. "You didn't have to order all that," she said, but her voice was thick with emotion and gratitude. "I know," Benjamin said, adding sugar to his own coffee and stirring it slowly. "But I wanted to." They sat in silence for a moment, and Ophelia sipped her coffee, savoring the bitter warmth and the way it seemed to spread through her whole body like liquid sunshine. Outside the window, Guthrie was going about its business, horses and wagons kicking up dust, men shouting to each other across the street, a dog barking somewhere in the distance. It had been less than 6 months since the land run that created this town overnight, turning empty prairie into a bustling community of 20,000 souls all trying to stake their claim in this new territory. Ophelia and her mother had come here full of hope, believing the stories about opportunity and fresh starts, never imagining that hope could die as quickly as it had been born. "How long have you been on your own?" Benjamin asked, breaking into her thoughts. Ophelia considered lying, but something about his direct gaze made her want to tell the truth. 3 months, she said. "Since my mother died. We came here after the land run, thought we could start a boarding house or a laundry, something to make a living. But she got sick almost as soon as we arrived, and by the time I realized how bad it was, there wasn't anything anyone could do. The doctor said it was pneumonia, though I don't see how she could have caught it in this heat." Benjamin's expression softened. "I'm sorry," he said, and she could tell he meant it. "You don't have any other family?" "No one," Ophelia said, taking another sip of coffee to wash down the lump in her throat. "My father died when I was 12, and it was just Mama and me after that. We were living in Kansas, but after the Homestead Act and all the talk about Oklahoma Territory opening up, she thought we could make something of ourselves here. I guess we were wrong." "You weren't wrong," Benjamin said firmly. "This territory is hard on everyone, and it's twice as hard on women alone. You can't blame yourself for bad luck." The food arrived then, and Ophelia's eyes widened at the sheer amount of it spread across their table. The chicken was golden and crispy, steam rising from the meat, surrounded by mashed potatoes swimming in gravy, green beans cooked with bacon, corn on the cob glistening with butter, and a basket of fresh bread that was still warm to the touch. The bowl of beef stew that Mary set in front of her was thick and rich, filled with chunks of meat and vegetables that looked like they'd come straight from heaven. "Go on," Benjamin said, picking up his own spoon. "Eat." Ophelia didn't need to be told twice. She took a spoonful of the stew and nearly moaned at the taste, the savory richness of it exploding across her tongue like nothing she'd ever experienced. She forced herself to eat slowly, to savor each bite instead of shoveling it down like she wanted to, because she knew if she ate too fast after going so long without proper food, she'd just make herself sick. Benjamin ate steadily across from her, but she noticed he kept pushing food toward her side of the table, encouraging her to take more bread, more butter, try the chicken, have some of the corn. They didn't talk much while they ate, but it was a comfortable silence, broken only by the clink of silverware and the low hum of conversation from the other tables. Ophelia felt like she was in a dream, one of those too good to be true fantasies she'd been having lately where everything suddenly worked out, and she didn't have to be afraid anymore. But this was real, the food was real, and the man sitting across from her was real, and she didn't know what to do with any of it. When she finally had to admit defeat, pushing her plate away with more than half the food still on it, Benjamin signaled Mary for a box. "We'll take the rest with us," he said, and Ophelia wanted to protest, but she was too full and too grateful to argue. The leftovers alone would feed her for days if she was careful. They were waiting for Mary to return with the wrapped food when Ophelia finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind since they sat down. "Why are you doing this?" she said. "And please don't tell me it's just because your mother would want you to. Nobody is this kind without a reason." Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands and staring down at the dark liquid like it held answers to questions he hadn't asked yet. My parents came west when I was just a baby, he said finally. My father had dreams of owning land, being his own man instead of working someone else's farm for the rest of his life. We settled in Texas first, then moved up to Kansas when things got rough. My mother worked herself to the bone trying to keep us all fed, and I remember watching her go without so my sisters and I could eat. She never complained, never made us feel like we were a burden, but I knew. I always knew. He paused, and Ophelia waited, sensing there was more to the story. When I was 15, my father was killed in a dispute over water rights. Some rancher decided he owned the creek that ran through our property, and when my father argued, the man shot him. Just like that, over water. My mother tried to hold onto the land, but it was too much for her alone. We lost everything, and she died 2 years later, worn out from trying to survive. My sisters went to live with an aunt in Missouri, and I headed out on my own, determined to make something of myself so I could take care of them. Ophelia's heart clenched at the pain in his voice, the old wounds that still hadn't quite healed. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "Did you make something of yourself, I mean?" A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I've got a small ranch about 10 miles outside of town. It's not much yet, but it's mine, bought and paid for with money I earned breaking horses and working cattle drives. I've got 30 head of cattle, a decent house, and enough land to grow it into something bigger if I work hard enough. My sisters are both married now, got families of their own, so I don't have to worry about them anymore. But I remember what it was like to be hungry and desperate and watching people walk past like you don't exist. I swore I'd never do that to someone else if I could help it." Mary returned with the wrapped food in a basket, along with the pie and cookies Benjamin had ordered. He paid her with coins from his pocket, waving away the change she tried to give him, and then they were walking back out into the afternoon heat. Ophelia carried the basket, holding it carefully like it was full of gold instead of leftovers, and Benjamin walked beside her with his hands in his pockets and his hat pulled low against the sun. "Where are you staying?" he asked as they paused at the end of the street. Ophelia felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the weather. "Nowhere, really," she admitted. "I've been sleeping wherever I can find a place that's safe and dry. The stable when the owner isn't looking, sometimes in the church if the doors are unlocked, behind the general store if it's not too cold." Benjamin's jaw tightened again, and she was starting to recognize that look as anger, though not directed at her. "That's not safe," he said flatly. "A woman alone in this town, sleeping rough, you're asking for trouble." "I know," Ophelia said, and she hated the defeat in her own voice. "But I don't have any other options. I've tried to find work, but nobody wants to hire a woman with no references and no skills. I can cook and clean and sew, but so can every other woman in this territory, and they all have husbands or fathers vouching for them. I'm nobody, nothing, just another mouth to feed in a town that's already bursting at the seams." Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him thinking, working through something in his mind. Finally, he said, "Come work for me." Ophelia stared at him. "What?" "Come work for me at the ranch," he repeated, meeting her eyes steadily. "I could use help with the cooking and cleaning, and the garden is overrun because I don't have time to tend it properly. You'd have your own room, 3 meals a day, and I'd pay you a fair wage. Nothing inappropriate," he added quickly, as if reading the worry on her face. "Everything proper and above board. You'd be an employee, nothing more." It was too good to be true, had to be, because things like this didn't happen to women like her. "I don't understand," she said slowly. "You don't even know me. How do you know I won't rob you blind the first chance I get?" "Will you?" he asked, one eyebrow raised. "No," she said immediately, almost offended by the suggestion. I'm not a thief." "Then I guess we don't have a problem," Benjamin said. "Look, I'm not some saint trying to rescue you out of the goodness of my heart. I genuinely need help at the ranch, and you genuinely need work. Seems like a situation that benefits us both. What do you say?" Ophelia's mind was racing, trying to find the catch, the hidden danger, but she couldn't see one. Even if his intentions weren't entirely pure, which she didn't think they were based on how he'd behaved so far, she'd still have food and shelter, and a chance to save some money. And if things went bad, well, they couldn't be much worse than sleeping behind saloons and digging through garbage for food. "Okay," she said finally. "Yes, thank you." Benjamin nodded like it was settled. "I've got a few more errands to run in town, but we can head out to the ranch before sundown." "That work for you?" "I don't have anything to pack," Ophelia said, gesturing to herself with a self-deprecating smile. "This is everything I own." Something shifted in his expression again, that same look she'd seen earlier when she told him how long it had been since she'd eaten. "We'll fix that too," he said. "Come on." He led her down the street to the general store, and before she could protest, he was pulling her inside and talking to the woman behind the counter about dresses and shoes and undergarments, speaking with the matter-of-fact tone of someone buying supplies for a cattle drive. Ophelia stood there in shock as he ordered 2 work dresses, a Sunday dress, sturdy boots, a coat for when the weather turned, nightgowns, stockings, and a dozen other items she couldn't quite process because her brain seemed to have stopped working entirely. "Benjamin, you can't," she said, finding her voice finally. "This is too much. The meal was one thing, but this is, I can't let you do this." He turned to her and his face was serious, almost stern. "You need clothes, Ophelia. You can't work in what you're wearing now, it's falling apart. Consider it an advance on your wages if it makes you feel better, and I'll take it out of your pay a little at a time until it's settled. But you're going to need these things, so there's no point in arguing about it." The woman behind the counter was watching them with undisguised interest, and Ophelia knew this story would be all over Guthrie by nightfall, but she found she didn't care anymore. Her pride had already been stripped away by hunger and desperation, and if accepting help from a kind stranger meant she could survive another day, then so be it. "Thank you," she said quietly, and meant it with every fiber of her being. They left the general store with a package wrapped in brown paper tucked under Benjamin's arm, and he led her to the livery stable where a handsome bay horse was waiting, already saddled. The animal nickered softly when it saw Benjamin, and he rubbed its nose affectionately before checking the saddle bags. "This is Rusty," he said. "He's getting old, but he's still got plenty of spirit. You know how to ride?" Ophelia nodded. "My father taught me when I was young." "It's been a while, but I think I remember." "You can ride with me then," Benjamin said, swinging up into the saddle with easy grace and then reaching down to help her up behind him. Ophelia hesitated only a moment before taking his hand, letting him pull her up to settle onto the horse's back behind the saddle. She had to wrap her arms around his waist to keep from sliding off, and she tried not to think about how solid he felt, how warm, how safe. They rode out of Guthrie as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. The prairie stretched out around them, endless and beautiful and harsh, and Ophelia watched it roll past with a mixture of wonder and trepidation. She'd been so focused on surviving in town that she'd almost forgotten how big the world was out here, how small and insignificant human problems seemed against the backdrop of all this space. Benjamin's ranch appeared after about an hour of riding, a collection of buildings nestled against a rise in the land with a creek running nearby. The house was small but sturdy, built from rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides. There was a barn, a chicken coop, a small corral with a few horses grazing lazily in the evening heat, and what looked like a vegetable garden that had indeed been taken over by weeds. It wasn't much, but to Ophelia's eyes it looked like paradise, a place where a person could put down roots and build something lasting. Benjamin helped her down from the horse and then led Rusty into the barn, talking softly to the animal as he unsaddled him and rubbed him down. Ophelia stood in the doorway watching, noting the care he took with his horse, the gentle way he handled the tack, the obvious affection between man and beast. It told her more about his character than any words could have. When Rusty was settled in his stall with fresh water and hay, Benjamin picked up the packages they'd brought from town and led Ophelia to the house. The inside was exactly what she'd expected: simple, functional, and clean despite the obvious lack of a woman's touch. There was a main room with a fireplace, a kitchen area with a cast iron stove, 2 bedrooms on either side, and a loft above that looked like it was being used for storage. The furniture was handmade but well crafted, and everything had a place even if that place was a bit dusty from neglect. "That room is yours," Benjamin said, pointing to the smaller of the 2 bedrooms. "There's a bed and a dresser, nothing fancy, but it's comfortable enough. The privy is out back about 30 yards, and there's a wash basin and pitcher in your room for morning. Water pump is just outside the back door. You need anything, just ask." Ophelia walked into the room he'd indicated, setting down the basket of food and the package of new clothes on the bed. It was small but cozy, with a window that looked out over the prairie and a handmade quilt on the bed in a pattern of blue and white. She ran her hand over it, feeling the careful stitches, and wondered who had made it. "This is lovely," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word because she was so overwhelmed she didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "My mother made that quilt," Benjamin said from the doorway, "before she died. I want you to have it." Ophelia turned to look at him, tears streaming down her face now without her permission. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "I don't know how to ever repay you for this kindness. You've saved my life today, and I don't even know why." Benjamin crossed the room in 2 long strides and, to her surprise, pulled her into a hug. It was awkward and gentle at the same time, like he wasn't quite sure what to do with his arms but knew she needed the comfort anyway. Ophelia buried her face in his shoulder and let herself cry, really cry, for the first time since her mother died, and he just stood there and held her until the storm passed. "You don't have to repay me," he said when she finally pulled back, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Just work hard, help me turn this place into something worth having, and we'll call it even. Deal?" Ophelia nodded, sniffling. "Deal." They spent the rest of the evening getting settled, with Benjamin showing her around the property and explaining his routine. He was up before dawn to tend the cattle and horses, checking fences and water sources and making sure everything was secure. He'd come back midday for lunch, then head out again until sundown unless the weather or some emergency kept him close to the house. Ophelia's job would be to manage the house, cook the meals, tend the garden, care for the chickens, and generally keep things running smoothly while he focused on building up the ranch. It was hard work, he warned her, and some days she'd be exhausted to the bone, but it was honest work and he'd treat her fairly. Ophelia assured him she wasn't afraid of hard work, that she'd do whatever needed doing and more besides, because this chance he was giving her felt like a gift from God, and she wasn't about to waste it. That night, she ate leftover chicken and bread at the small kitchen table while Benjamin fried himself some eggs and bacon, and they talked about nothing and everything. The weather, the cattle, the town gossip, his plans for expanding the herd. It was easy conversation, comfortable, and Ophelia found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months. When she finally climbed into bed in her new room, wearing one of the new nightgowns and surrounded by the smell of fresh linens and that beautiful quilt, she fell asleep before her head fully hit the pillow. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt almost like healing. Ophelia threw herself into the work with determination, rising early to make breakfast, tending the chickens and gathering eggs, attacking the overgrown garden with a fury that surprised even herself. She scrubbed and cleaned and organized, bringing order to the little house in ways Benjamin had never bothered with. She learned his preferences for how he liked his coffee and his steak, figured out how to manage the temperamental wood stove, and discovered she had a knack for baking bread that made Benjamin groan with pleasure every time she pulled a fresh loaf from the oven. Benjamin, for his part, was true to his word. He treated her with respect and courtesy, never overstepping boundaries, never making her feel uncomfortable or unsafe. He taught her things about ranch life she'd never known, showed her how to handle the horses, let her ride out with him sometimes when he was checking on the cattle. They talked while they worked, sharing stories about their pasts, their hopes, their fears, and slowly, cautiously, something began to grow between them that neither of them wanted to name. October arrived with cooler temperatures and the promise of rain, and Ophelia found herself thinking less about survival and more about the future. She had money now, wages that Benjamin paid her every week in coins she tucked carefully into a jar hidden in her dresser. She had clothes and food and a safe place to sleep, but more than that, she had purpose, and she had someone who seemed to genuinely value her presence. Benjamin laughed more now, smiled easier, and sometimes she'd catch him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, but that made her heart flutter in her chest like a caged bird. It was on a cool morning in late October when everything changed. Ophelia was in the kitchen kneading bread dough, flour dusting her arms up to her elbows when Benjamin came in from his morning rounds looking troubled. "There's a storm coming," he said, washing his hands at the basin. "A big one from the looks of it. I need to get the cattle moved to the south pasture where there's more shelter and make sure everything is battened down here. It's going to be a long day." "What can I do to help?" Ophelia asked immediately, wiping her hands on her apron. Benjamin hesitated. "The bread can wait." "I need you to help me with the horses. Get them all into the barn and make sure there's plenty of hay and water. Then board up the windows on the chicken coop and move anything loose into the barn that might blow away." "Can you handle that?" "Of course," Ophelia said, already untying her apron. They worked together through the morning and into the afternoon, racing against the darkening sky and the wind that was starting to pick up, carrying with it the smell of rain and electricity. By the time they got the last of the preparations done, the first drops were starting to fall, huge and heavy, splattering against the dry ground like bullets. They ran for the house just as the sky opened up, drenching them both in seconds. Benjamin slammed the door behind them, and they stood there dripping on the floor, breathing hard and looking at each other. Ophelia's hair had come loose from its braid, hanging in wet ropes around her face, and her dress was plastered to her body in ways that made her suddenly very aware of how Benjamin was looking at her. His shirt was soaked through, clinging to the muscles of his chest and arms, and water was dripping from his hair into his eyes. "We should get changed," Ophelia said, and her voice came out breathless and strange. Benjamin nodded but didn't move, and the air between them seemed to thicken with something Ophelia had been trying very hard not to acknowledge for the past few weeks. "Ophelia," he said, and the way he said her name made her shiver in a way that had nothing to do with being cold and wet. "Yes." She whispered, He took a step closer and then another until they were almost touching. I know I said this was just a job, that everything would be proper and professional, but I need you to know that's getting harder for me every day. I care about you more than I should, more than is probably wise given how we met and how long we've known each other. And if you don't feel the same way, that's fine. We can go back to how things were, but I had to tell you. I had to be honest. Ophelia's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Benjamin," she said, reaching up to touch his face, her fingers trembling against his rough jaw. "I feel the same way. I've felt it for weeks, but I was too afraid to say anything. Too afraid you'd think I was just grateful or trying to secure my position here. But it's not that. You're kind and good, and you make me feel safe in a way I've never felt before. And I don't know what to do with these feelings, but I know they're real." He kissed her then, soft and gentle at first, like he was afraid she might break. But when she kissed him back, threading her fingers through his wet hair and pressing herself against him, something seemed to break loose in both of them. They kissed like they were drowning and each other was air, like they'd been waiting their whole lives for this moment and couldn't believe it was finally happening. The storm raged outside, wind howling and rain pounding against the roof. But inside the house, there was only warmth and want and the overwhelming feeling of finally coming home. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Benjamin rested his forehead against hers. "We should probably still get changed," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. Ophelia laughed, giddy and breathless. "Probably," she agreed, but neither of them moved for a long moment, too caught up in the wonder of what had just happened between them. The storm lasted through the night, one of those violent Oklahoma thunderstorms that seemed determined to remake the world through sheer force of nature. Ophelia and Benjamin sat together by the fire, properly dressed now but sitting close enough that their shoulders touched, talking about everything and nothing while the lightning flashed through the windows. They talked about the future, about the ranch and what it could become, about dreams neither of them had dared to voice before. Benjamin told her he'd been lonely out here, that the work was satisfying but there was something missing, some piece he couldn't name until she walked into his life. Ophelia confessed that she'd been so focused on survival that she'd forgotten what it felt like to want something beyond just making it through another day. But now she wanted everything. A home, a family, a life built with someone who saw her as more than just a burden or a convenience. When the storm finally passed and the stars came out, brilliant and clear in the washed clean sky, Benjamin walked Ophelia to her bedroom door. He kissed her goodnight, sweet and chaste, and promised they'd take things slow, do everything right. But the look in his eyes told her he was as impatient as she was for the future to arrive. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest of Ophelia's life. She and Benjamin courted properly, despite living under the same roof, with him bringing her wildflowers from the prairie and taking her on rides to see the sunset. They talked about marriage, about when would be the right time, and Benjamin insisted on doing things properly even though Ophelia told him she didn't need a big wedding or fancy ceremony. He wanted to give her everything she deserved, he said, and he was determined to make sure everyone in Guthrie knew she was going to be his wife, and not just his hired help. In November, Benjamin rode into town and came back with a simple gold band that had belonged to his grandmother. He got down on one knee in front of the fireplace and asked Ophelia to marry him with words that were clumsy and heartfelt and perfect. She said yes through happy tears, and they held each other while the fire crackled and popped, making plans for a wedding in the spring when the prairie would be green and alive. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. In early December, A man rode up to the ranch looking for Benjamin, bringing news that made his face go pale. There was trouble in town, a dispute over land rights that was threatening to turn violent, and Benjamin's name had come up because he'd filed a claim on an adjacent property that someone else was now contesting. The man said Benjamin needed to come to Guthrie immediately to meet with the land office and a judge, or he risked losing everything he'd worked for. "I have to go," Benjamin said, already moving to gather his things. "This could take days to sort out, maybe longer. Will you be all right here alone?" Ophelia wanted to say no, wanted to beg him to stay or to take her with him, but she could see the worry in his eyes and knew this was serious. "I'll be fine," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I can handle the ranch for a few days. You go take care of this." He kissed her hard before he left, promising to be back as soon as humanly possible. And then he was gone, riding toward Guthrie at a gallop while Ophelia stood on the porch watching until he disappeared over the horizon. The first day alone was strange but manageable. Ophelia fed the animals, collected eggs, made herself a simple dinner, and went to bed early. But on the second day, she woke to find one of the horses had gone lame, and she spent hours trying to figure out what was wrong before finally determining it had picked up a stone bruise. She managed to tend to it, remembering what Benjamin had taught her, but it shook her confidence in her ability to handle everything alone. The third day brought a visitor. A man Ophelia didn't recognize, rough-looking and mean-eyed, who rode up to the house and demanded to know where Benjamin was. Ophelia stood on the porch with the rifle Benjamin had left for her protection, trying to look braver than she felt, and told the man Benjamin was away on business. "When's he coming back?" the man demanded, and there was something in his tone that made Ophelia's skin crawl. "Soon," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Can I give him a message?" The man studied her for a long moment, his gaze crawling over her in a way that made her want to run inside and bar the door. "You tell him Marcus Trent came by," he said finally. "Tell him we need to have a conversation about his land claim, and that it would be in his best interest to be reasonable." "You got that?" "I've got it," Ophelia said, her hands tight on the rifle. Marcus Trent sneered at her, tipped his hat in a mockery of politeness, and rode away. Ophelia watched until he was out of sight before finally lowering the rifle, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. She went inside and barred the door, her heart racing, and tried to tell herself she'd done the right thing. But she couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was coming, and Benjamin was caught in the middle of it. He returned on the fourth day, looking exhausted and frustrated. The land dispute was worse than he'd thought, with Marcus Trent claiming that Benjamin's filed paperwork was fraudulent and demanding the land be given to him instead. The judge had ordered a hearing for the following week, and Benjamin needed to gather evidence to prove his claim was legitimate. "I don't understand," Ophelia said as they sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around his. "Your claim is legal, isn't it? You said you filed everything properly during the land run." "I did," Benjamin said, scrubbing a hand over his face. "But Trent is claiming I cheated somehow, that I had inside information or jumped the gun. It's all lies, but he's got money and connections, and I'm just one man trying to hold onto what's mine. The judge will hear both sides, but there's no guarantee which way it'll go." Ophelia felt cold fear settle in her stomach. "What happens if you lose?" "Then I lose the additional land I claimed," Benjamin said. "Not this property where the house is, but the pasture land to the north that I need for expanding the herd. Without it, I can't grow the ranch the way I planned. I'll be stuck at this size forever, barely scraping by, unable to build the kind of life I want for us." "We'll figure it out," Ophelia said firmly. "Even if you lose the land, we'll find a way. We've both survived worse than this." Benjamin smiled at her, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're right," he said. "I just hate that this is happening now, right when everything was finally going well. It feels like the universe is testing us." "Then we'll pass the test," Ophelia said, leaning across the table to kiss him. "Together." The week before the hearing was tense, with Benjamin spending every spare moment gathering documents and testimony from other ranchers who could vouch for his character and his claim. Ophelia helped however she could, writing letters at his dictation, organizing papers, making sure he ate and slept even when he insisted he didn't have time for either. She also told him about Marcus Trent's visit, and the look on Benjamin's face when she described the man's behavior made her worry he was going to do something rash. "He threatened you," Benjamin said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Not exactly," Ophelia said carefully. "He was just unpleasant. Intimidating, but I had the rifle and he didn't try anything." "If he comes back here while I'm gone, you don't answer the door," Benjamin said. "You stay inside with the rifle and you shoot first if he tries to force his way in. Promise me." "I promise," Ophelia said, though the thought of shooting someone made her feel sick. "But you need to promise me something too. Promise me you won't do anything stupid at this hearing. No matter what Trent says or does, you stay calm and let the judge decide. Fighting him or losing your temper will only make things worse." Benjamin was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "I promise. But if he wins this through lies and corruption, I'm not just going to roll over and accept it. I'll fight him in every legal way I can." The day of the hearing arrived cold and gray, with the promise of winter in the air. Benjamin dressed in his best clothes, such as they were, and Ophelia packed him food for the journey and kissed him goodbye with all the love and encouragement she could muster. "You'll win," she told him. "I know you will. The truth has to count for something." "I hope you're right," Benjamin said, holding her close. "I'll be back tonight or tomorrow at the latest, depending on how long this takes. You'll be okay here." "I'll be fine," Ophelia assured him. "Go fight for what's yours." She watched him ride away with a heavy heart, then set about her daily chores with fierce determination, refusing to let worry paralyze her. The day passed slowly, each hour feeling like an eternity, and by the time the sun set with no sign of Benjamin's return, Ophelia was pacing the house like a caged animal. She tried to tell herself it meant nothing, that the hearing had just run long, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Night fell, dark and cold, and still Benjamin didn't come home. Ophelia kept the fire burning and a lamp in the window, hoping to see the shape of a rider appear over the horizon, but the prairie remained empty and silent. She finally fell asleep in the chair by the fire, the rifle across her lap, and woke with a start when someone pounded on the door just after dawn. She stumbled to her feet, heart racing, and called out, "Who is it?" "Sheriff Dawson from Guthrie," came the reply. "I need to speak with you, miss." Ophelia opened the door cautiously, the rifle still in her hands, to find a middle-aged man with a star pinned to his vest standing on her porch. His face was grim, and Ophelia's stomach dropped. "What's happened?" she asked. "Where's Benjamin? Can I come in?" The sheriff asked, and his tone told her she wasn't going to like what he had to say. She let him in, her hands numb with fear, and listened as he explained that the hearing yesterday had not gone well. The judge had ruled in Marcus Trent's favor, declaring that there were irregularities in Benjamin's claim and awarding the disputed land to Trent. Benjamin had been furious but controlled, right up until Trent made a comment about Ophelia that the sheriff wouldn't repeat. Benjamin had punched Trent in the face, breaking his nose, and the ensuing brawl had gotten Benjamin arrested for assault. "He's in jail?" Ophelia asked, the words not quite making sense. "For now," the sheriff said. Trent is pushing for charges, but between you and me, most folks in town think Benjamin had cause. Unfortunately, what's right and what's legal aren't always the same thing. The judge set bail at $50, which Benjamin doesn't have on him. I came out here to let you know the situation and see if there's any way to raise the money to get him out. $50. Ophelia's mind raced. She had maybe $20 saved from her wages, and there was probably another 10 or 15 in the jar where Benjamin kept household money, but that was nowhere near enough. I don't have that much, she said, trying not to panic, but I'll find it somehow. Can I see him? Once you come into town, sure, the sheriff said. Look, miss, I know this is a bad situation, but Benjamin's a good man who got a raw deal. Trent's been causing trouble for a lot of folks around here, using his money and influence to bully people into giving up their claims. Your man just had the misfortune of standing up to him. If there's anything I can do to help within the bounds of the law, I will. Ophelia thanked him and watched him ride away, then immediately started gathering what money she could find. She changed into her Sunday dress, the nicest thing she owned, and saddled one of the horses with shaking hands. The ride into Guthrie felt endless, but she finally arrived mid-morning, heading straight for the bank. The banker, a portly man named Mr. Henderson, listened to her story with sympathetic but practical eyes. I'm sorry, Miss Parker, but I can't loan you money based on your wages alone. Do you have any collateral, property, jewelry, anything of value? Ophelia looked down at her hands, at the simple gold band Benjamin had given her when he proposed. She'd been wearing it even though they weren't married yet, unable to bear the thought of it being anywhere but on her finger. Slowly, painfully, she pulled it off and set it on Mr. Henderson's desk. This, she said, it was his grandmother's. It's worth more than $50, I'm sure. Mr. Henderson picked up the ring, examining it carefully, then looked at her with something like respect in his eyes. All right, he said. I'll loan you the $50 against this ring. You have 6 months to pay it back with interest or the ring becomes property of the bank. That agreeable? Yes, Ophelia said, though her heart was breaking. Thank you. With the money in hand, she went straight to the sheriff's office and paid Benjamin's bail. He was brought out from the cells looking rumpled and angry, but his face transformed when he saw her. Ophelia, he said, pulling her into his arms, you didn't have to do this. I would have figured something out. Of course I had to, she said, her voice muffled against his chest. I love you. Where else would I be? It wasn't until they were riding back to the ranch together with Ophelia behind him on Rusty just like that first day that she told him about the ring. She felt him stiffen, felt the moment he understood what she'd done, and when they got home he turned to her with anguish written all over his face. You gave up your ring, he said. Ophelia, that was your wedding ring, my grandmother's ring. How could I let you do that? You didn't let me do anything, Ophelia said firmly. I made a choice. The ring is just a thing, Benjamin. You're real and you're here, and that's what matters. We'll get it back. I'll work extra, take in laundry from town, whatever I have to do, and we'll get it back. Benjamin pulled her close and she felt him shaking. I've lost the land, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I've lost the ring. I've probably made an enemy who won't stop until he's destroyed everything I've worked for, and I've dragged you into all of this. You'd be better off without me. Ophelia pulled back and looked him straight in the eye. Don't you dare, she said. Don't you dare give up now. So we lost the land. So what? We still have this ranch, we still have each other, and we still have a future. Trent can't take that away unless we let him. And as for me being better off without you, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. You saved my life, Benjamin Lawson. You gave me hope when I had nothing left. I'm not going anywhere, not now, not ever. We're in this together. He kissed her then, hard and desperate, and Ophelia kissed him back with all the fierce love she'd been holding inside. They would survive this. They'd survived worse, and they'd do it together. The months that followed were difficult but not impossible. Benjamin threw himself into the ranch work with renewed determination, and Ophelia made good on her promise to take in laundry from town, spending her evenings scrubbing clothes in addition to her regular work. They lived lean, cutting every expense they could, saving every penny toward getting the ring back. It was hard, exhausting work, but they did it side by side, and somehow that made it bearable. In February, Marcus Trent's ranch house burned down in a mysterious fire, and though there was no proof of who was responsible, Trent accused Benjamin loudly and publicly. The sheriff investigated but found no evidence, and eventually the matter was dropped, though it left a cloud of suspicion hanging over Benjamin that made life in Guthrie uncomfortable. Some people believed he'd done it, others didn't, but everyone had an opinion, and Ophelia found herself defending Benjamin's character to anyone who would listen through it all. Their love only grew stronger. They were married in March in a simple ceremony at the church, with just a few friends present, and no fancy celebration. Ophelia wore her Sunday dress and carried wildflowers, and Benjamin wore his cleanest shirt and looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. The preacher pronounced them man and wife, and they kissed while the small congregation applauded, and Ophelia felt like her heart might burst with happiness. They couldn't afford a honeymoon or even a wedding night at the hotel, so they went back to the ranch and made dinner together, laughing and talking and stealing kisses between stirring the stew and setting the table. That night, in the bedroom they now shared, Benjamin made love to her with tenderness and passion, and Ophelia felt like she was finally, truly home. Spring arrived with its promise of renewal, bringing green grass and wildflowers and warmer days. The cattle were thriving, and Benjamin managed to add a few more head to the herd through careful saving and a good deal from a neighboring rancher. Ophelia's garden flourished under her care, providing fresh vegetables for their table and enough extra to sell in town. Slowly, penny by penny, they were building the life they'd dreamed of. In April, Ophelia discovered she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but when she finally told Benjamin, his reaction was everything she'd hoped for and more. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing like a child, then immediately set her down gently and apologized for being too rough. They spent the evening making plans, talking about names and futures and all the possibilities this baby represented. "We need to get your ring back before the baby comes," Benjamin said, running his hand over her still flat stomach. "I want our child to know that their mama has her wedding ring where it belongs." "We will," Ophelia said, covering his hand with hers. "We're almost there. Another month or two and we'll have enough." But fate, it seemed, had one more test in store for them. In May, a tornado tore through the area, missing their ranch by less than a mile but devastating several other properties in the area. Benjamin immediately organized a group of ranchers to help with the recovery, and he spent days helping neighbors rebuild, even though it meant putting his own work aside. Ophelia was proud of him but worried about the money they were losing by him not working their own land. One of the families hit hardest was a widow named Mrs. Patterson and her 3 young children. Their house had been completely destroyed, along with most of their possessions, and they had nowhere to go. Without hesitation, Benjamin invited them to stay at the ranch until they could figure something out, and Ophelia found herself caring for 4 extra people on top of her regular work and her pregnancy. It was exhausting and challenging, but it was also rewarding in ways Ophelia hadn't expected. The children brought life and laughter to the ranch, and Mrs. Patterson was grateful to the point of tears, helping with the work wherever she could despite her own grief and exhaustion. They became friends, these two women thrown together by circumstance, sharing stories and hopes and fears while they worked side by side. After 3 weeks, Mrs. Patterson's brother arrived from Kansas to take her and the children back to live with him. She hugged Ophelia and Benjamin goodbye with tears streaming down her face, thanking them over and over for their kindness. "You're angels," she said, "both of you. I'll never forget what you've done for us." When they were gone, the house felt too quiet, and Ophelia found herself missing the noise and chaos. "We're going to have our own chaos soon enough," Benjamin said, pulling her close. "Just a few more months and our baby will be here." They finally scraped together enough money in June to pay back the loan and reclaim the ring. Ophelia cried when Benjamin slipped it back onto her finger, and they stood there in the bank holding each other while Mr. Henderson looked on with a satisfied smile. "Congratulations," he said. "Not many people manage to pay back a loan that fast. You two should be proud of yourselves." They were proud and relieved and ready to finally relax and enjoy the fruits of their labor. The summer passed peacefully, with Benjamin working the ranch and Ophelia preparing for the baby. They painted the second bedroom, built a cradle from oak wood Benjamin cut himself, and collected baby clothes and supplies donated by the ladies from church. In September, almost exactly 1 year after Benjamin had found Ophelia behind that saloon digging through garbage, she went into labor. It was long and difficult, with a midwife from town coaching her through while Benjamin paced the main room and worried. But when the baby finally arrived, healthy and squalling, with Benjamin's dark hair and Ophelia's eyes, every moment of pain and fear was forgotten. "It's a boy," the midwife announced, placing the baby in Ophelia's arms. "A fine, strong boy." Benjamin came to sit beside them on the bed, looking down at his son with wonder. "He's perfect," he whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand with one finger. "Absolutely perfect." They named him Thomas, after Benjamin's father, and called him Tommy. He was a good baby, healthy and happy, and watching Benjamin with his son made Ophelia fall in love with her husband all over again. He was patient and gentle, not afraid to change diapers or walk the floor at night when Tommy was fussy, and he talked to the baby constantly, telling him about the ranch and the cattle and all the things they'd do together when Tommy was old enough. Life settled into a new rhythm with Tommy in their lives. The ranch continued to grow slowly but steadily, and Benjamin's reputation in the community improved as people saw the kind of man he really was: hardworking, honest, generous to a fault. Even the lingering suspicions about the fire at Trent's ranch faded as other, more interesting gossip took their place. Marcus Trent himself left Oklahoma Territory in the fall, returning to Texas after a series of business failures left him nearly bankrupt. Benjamin heard the news with grim satisfaction, but no real joy, telling Ophelia he was just glad the man was gone, and they could move forward without looking over their shoulders. The disputed land was sold to another rancher, and though Benjamin regretted losing it, he'd made peace with the situation. "We have everything we need right here," he said, gesturing at the ranch at Ophelia and Tommy. "The rest is just details." The first year of Tommy's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and precious moments. He grew from a tiny infant into a chubby, active baby who crawled everywhere and got into everything. Ophelia spent her days chasing after him, managing the house, helping with the ranch, and somehow managing to stay sane through it all. Benjamin was her partner in every sense of the word, sharing the work and the joy and the exhaustion. They celebrated their first wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner after Tommy was asleep, toasting each other with coffee since Ophelia was pregnant again. This baby had been a surprise but a welcome one, and they were both excited about giving Tommy a sibling. "You ever think about that day?" Ophelia asked as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the prairie. "The day we met, all the time," Benjamin said, his arm around her shoulders. "I think about how easily I could have just walked past, could have minded my own business and never known what I was missing. It scares me sometimes how much of life comes down to chance and timing." "I don't think it was chance," Ophelia said. "I think we were meant to find each other. Maybe that's silly or romantic nonsense, but I really believe it. Everything that happened, all the bad and the good, it led us here. To this life, to Tommy, to everything we've built together. I wouldn't change a single thing." Benjamin kissed the top of her head. "Neither would I." "Well, maybe I'd change the part where I punched Trent and got arrested. That was pretty stupid." Ophelia laughed. "What did he say about me anyway?" "You never told me." "And I'm not going to," Benjamin said firmly. "It doesn't matter now. He's gone, we're here, and life is good. That's all that matters." Their second child, a daughter they named Rose, was born in the spring of 1891, 2 years after that fateful day when Benjamin had found Ophelia behind the saloon. She had Ophelia's auburn hair and Benjamin's storm-gray eyes, and she was fierce and stubborn from the moment she entered the world. Tommy was fascinated by his baby sister, insisting on helping with everything from diaper changes to feedings, and Ophelia's heart swelled watching her family grow. The ranch prospered over the next few years, growing from a small operation into a respectable spread that employed 2 ranch hands and supported dozens of head of cattle. Benjamin's hard work and honest dealing earned him respect throughout the territory, and Ophelia became known for her kindness and her garden, which produced more vegetables than they could possibly eat, and which she shared freely with anyone in need. They had 2 more children over the years, another son named James and a daughter they called Lily, and the house that had once felt too quiet now rang with laughter and chaos. Ophelia sometimes thought back to those desperate days when she'd been alone and starving, picking through garbage just to survive, and she could hardly believe this was her life now. She had a husband who loved her, children who adored her, a home that was warm and safe and full of joy. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Benjamin surprised her with a trip to Guthrie, arranging for Mrs. Patterson, who had returned to Oklahoma Territory and now ran a boarding house in town, to watch the children for the night. They had dinner at Mary's place, the same restaurant where Benjamin had taken her that first day, and Mary herself came out to greet them with hugs and congratulations. "I remember when he brought you in here," Mary said, her eyes twinkling. "I thought to myself, that's a man smitten even if he doesn't know it yet. And you looked like a scared rabbit, but there was steel underneath. I knew you'd be all right together." After dinner, they walked through town hand in hand, looking at how much Guthrie had grown and changed since those early days. The population had exploded, new buildings going up every month, businesses thriving, the wild frontier slowly being tamed into something resembling civilization. But some things remained the same: the red dirt streets, the endless sky, the sense that anything was possible if you were willing to work hard enough. "You miss it?" Benjamin asked as they stood looking out at the prairie beyond the edge of town. "The East, or cities, or anything from before?" Ophelia shook her head. "This is home now. These wide open spaces, this life we've built, our children growing up with mud on their boots and stars over their heads every night. I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world." Benjamin pulled her close, kissing her under the Oklahoma stars, and Ophelia felt the same flutter in her chest that she'd felt that first time. soaking wet from the storm and finally admitting what had been growing between them. Love hadn't made life easy, hadn't solved all their problems or removed all obstacles, but it had made everything worthwhile. It had given her a reason to fight, a reason to hope, a reason to believe that tomorrow could be better than today. Years continued to pass, bringing both joy and sorrow as life always does. They lost Benjamin's horse Rusty to old age, and Ophelia cried as hard as Benjamin did, remembering how that gentle animal had carried her to safety on her first day at the ranch. They weathered droughts and hard winters, illnesses and injuries, the normal trials of ranch life in Oklahoma Territory. But they weathered them together, and that made all the difference. Tommy grew into a tall, serious boy who loved the ranch and the cattle, who followed his father everywhere, and soaked up Benjamin's teaching like a sponge. Rose was wild and fierce, more interested in riding horses than learning to sew, and Ophelia saw so much of herself in her daughter's stubborn independence. James was the quiet one, thoughtful and kind, always bringing her wildflowers and helping with his younger sister. And Lily was pure sunshine, laughing at everything, charming everyone she met, impossible not to love. When Oklahoma Territory became Oklahoma State in 1907, the Lawson family attended the celebration in Guthrie, which had been named the state capital. They stood in the crowd watching the ceremonies, and Benjamin squeezed Ophelia's hand. "We built this," he said quietly. "Not just us, but everyone who came here with nothing and made something out of dust and dreams. Our children are going to grow up in a state, not a territory. They'll have opportunities we never imagined." Ophelia looked at their children. Tommy, now 18 and already taller than his father, Rose at 16 beautiful and fierce, James at 13 quiet and thoughtful, and Lily at 10 still their baby even though she insisted she was practically grown. "We did good," she said. "Against all the odds, we did real good." By 1910, Tommy had taken over much of the daily running of the ranch, allowing Benjamin to slow down a bit, though he'd never fully retire. He was only 45 but looked older, worn down by years of hard work and Oklahoma weather, though he was still strong and vital. Ophelia had aged too. Her auburn hair now shot through with gray, her hands marked by decades of hard labor, but Benjamin still looked at her like she was the most beautiful woman in the world. Rose shocked them all by announcing she wanted to attend college in Oklahoma City, studying to become a teacher. Benjamin initially resisted, worried about his wild daughter going off alone, but Ophelia argued that Rose was smart and capable and deserved the chance to chase her dreams. In the end, Benjamin relented, and Rose left for college with their blessing and enough money to see her through the first year. James declared he wanted to be a veterinarian, fascinated by animals and their care, and he apprenticed himself to the town's only animal doctor. Lily was still young, still figuring out what she wanted, but she had time. On a warm September evening in 1914, 25 years after that day behind the saloon, Ophelia and Benjamin sat together on their porch watching the sunset. The ranch stretched out before them, prosperous and peaceful, and they could see Tommy in the distance riding back from checking the herd. Rose was home from college for the weekend, helping James in the barn, and Lily was practicing piano inside, the notes drifting out through the open windows. 25 years, Ophelia said softly. "Can you believe it?" "Some days yes, some days no," Benjamin admitted. "Some days it feels like a lifetime, and other days it feels like just yesterday that I found you behind that saloon looking like you were ready to fight the whole world with nothing but stubbornness and determination." Ophelia laughed. "I was terrified," she confessed. "Of you, of accepting your help, of hoping for something better because I'd learned that hope hurt worse than despair when it didn't work out. But you made it work out. You saved me in every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," Benjamin corrected, taking her hand and bringing it to his lips. "I was so lonely before you came, so focused on work and building something that I'd forgotten why I was doing it. You gave me purpose, gave me a family, gave me a reason to get up every morning that wasn't just about surviving." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and Ophelia thought about all the people they'd known and lost, all the struggles they'd overcome, all the joy they'd created together. Her mother would have been proud, she thought, would have loved her grandchildren and Benjamin and this life they'd carved out of nothing. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Taking me to that restaurant, bringing me here, changing your whole life for a stranger you found digging through garbage." Benjamin turned to look at her, and the love in his eyes was so fierce and bright it took her breath away even after all these years. "Never," he said. "Not once, not for a second. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Ophelia Lawson. Meeting you was the moment my real life began. Everything before that was just practice." Ophelia felt tears slip down her cheeks, happy tears, grateful tears. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you from the moment you ordered all that food and told me not to worry about the price. I have loved you through every hard day and every good one. I will love you until the day I die and probably beyond that too." "Good," Benjamin said, leaning over to kiss her. "Because you're stuck with me. Forever and always, just like we promised." As the sun set and the Oklahoma sky turned pink and gold and purple, Ophelia leaned against her husband's shoulder and let herself feel the full weight of her happiness. They'd started with nothing, built something beautiful, and raised children who would carry on their legacy of hard work and kindness. The Wild West was fading into memory, becoming something gentler and more civilized, but the lessons it had taught them remained. That people needed each other, that love could flourish in the harshest conditions, that second chances were possible if you were brave enough to take them. The restaurant where Benjamin had first taken her still stood in Guthrie, though Mary had passed on and her daughter ran it now. Sometimes when they went to town, they'd stop in for a meal, and Benjamin would order too much food just like he had that first time, and they'd laugh about how far they'd come. The clothes she'd worn that day, tattered and stained, she'd kept in a trunk in the attic, a reminder of where she'd been and how much her life had changed. Their children thrived and grew, each finding their own path, but always coming home for holidays and celebrations. Tommy eventually married a sweet girl from town and had children of his own, making Benjamin and Ophelia grandparents. Rose finished college and became a teacher just like she'd wanted, though she surprised them all by moving back to Guthrie to teach at the local school instead of staying in the city. James became a respected veterinarian, eventually taking over the practice when the old doctor retired. And Lily, their baby, grew into a talented musician who gave concerts in Oklahoma City and wrote songs about the prairie. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1934, their children threw them a party at the ranch, inviting everyone from miles around. The house and yard were packed with people, all wanting to celebrate Benjamin and Ophelia Lawson, a couple who'd become something of a legend in their community. They told stories about Benjamin's fairness and generosity, about Ophelia's kindness and her garden that had fed half the county during lean times, about how they'd taken in Mrs. Patterson and her children and helped countless others over the years. As Ophelia stood in the middle of all these people, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, she caught Benjamin's eye across the room and he smiled at her, that same smile he'd given her in the restaurant so many years ago. She smiled back, and in that moment, she understood that this was what happiness looked like. Not a single perfect moment, but a lifetime of moments strung together like beads on a string, each one precious, each one chosen, each one part of the larger tapestry of a life well lived. When the party was over and the guests had gone home, when the children had cleaned up and left and the house was quiet again, Benjamin and Ophelia walked out to the porch together, just like they'd done thousands of times before. The ranch was quiet under the stars, peaceful and prosperous, and Ophelia thought about that frightened, desperate woman who'd been picking through garbage behind a saloon 45 years ago, never imagining that salvation would come in the form of a cowboy with kind eyes and a generous heart. "Thank you," she said softly, taking Benjamin's hand. "For what?" he asked, genuinely confused. "For seeing me," Ophelia said. "For seeing past the dirt and the desperation and the fear and recognizing that I was worth saving. For taking me to that restaurant and ordering everything, for giving me a job and a home and a future. For loving me when I didn't think I was lovable. For all of it." Benjamin pulled her close, and she could feel his heart beating against her cheek, steady and strong. "You were always worth saving," he said. "You were always lovable. I just had the good fortune to be in the right place at the right time. But Ophelia, you saved yourself too. You took the chance I offered, worked harder than anyone I've ever known, and built this life right alongside me. We're partners, always have been, always will be." They stood there holding each other under the Oklahoma stars, two people who'd found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from nothing. The Wild West was gone now, tamed into farms and towns and paved roads, but the spirit of it remained in people like them, people who dared to dream and work and love with everything they had. Inside the house, their wedding photo hung on the wall, young faces full of hope and determination, and next to it were photos of their children and grandchildren, a growing family tree that would spread branches for generations to come. The ranch would stay in the family, passed down to Tommy and eventually to his children, keeping the Lawson name and legacy alive. But tonight wasn't about legacy or the future or anything beyond this moment. Tonight was about a man and a woman who'd weathered every storm, who'd chosen each other every single day for 45 years, who'd proven that love wasn't just a feeling but an action, a choice, a commitment renewed with every sunrise. "Come on," Benjamin said finally, breaking their comfortable silence. "Let's go inside. I'll make us some coffee." "I'll cut us some of that cake the children brought," Ophelia said, following him into the house. They sat at their kitchen table, the same one where they'd shared so many meals and conversations over the years, and ate cake and drank coffee and talked about nothing and everything. Outside, the Oklahoma night sang with crickets and the distant sound of cattle settling down for sleep. Inside, two people who'd started with nothing and built everything sat together in the warm glow of lamplight, content in the knowledge that they'd found what so many people spend their whole lives searching for. Someone to walk beside them through whatever life brought, someone to love and be loved by, someone to call home. This was their happy ending, but it wasn't really an ending at all. It was just another day in a life full of days, another moment in a story that would continue long after they were gone, carried forward by the children and grandchildren they'd raised with love and purpose. They'd started in desperation behind a saloon, continued through struggle and triumph, and arrived at peace and contentment, and through it all, they'd had each other. And really, Ophelia thought as she looked across the table at her husband, the man who'd seen her at her lowest point and decided she was worth everything. What more could anyone ask for than that? A love that endured, a family that thrived, and a life built on kindness and hard work and the simple decision to help someone in need. That was their legacy. That was their story, and it was more than enough.